The autumn of 1822 came to Ashvale Manor not as a season of harvest, but as a reckoning. The elm trees along the drive had begun to shed before their time, as though the house itself had grown too tired to hold anything upright. The roof above the east wing leaked in 3 places. The cellar held 6 bottles of claret where once there had been 600. And Sir Aldrich Penrose, who had once been considered one of the more comfortable baronets in the county of Cumberland, now spent his evenings at a writing desk covered in figures that never seemed to balance. His daughters were aware of this. They had been aware of it for some time. Cordelia Penrose, the younger by 4 years, was the one who kept the household accounts. Not because she had been asked to, because someone had to. Her sister Arabella spent her mornings at the piano, and her afternoons at the window that looked toward the road, watching for callers who rarely came any more. Cordelia spent her mornings reviewing what remained in the larder, and her afternoons mending curtains that had begun to fray along the hem. She was 26. She was not considered a beauty. She was considered by the few people who considered her at all to be sensible, reliable, the kind of woman who could be trusted with a household key and a difficult conversation. The kind of woman, in other words, who was easy to overlook until something needed to be done. Arabella was 29 and lovely in the way that made drawing rooms go quiet. She had a pale complexion and dark hair, and a habit of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was being admired, which gave her the appearance of a portrait that had learned to breathe. She was not unkind. She was simply accustomed to the world arranging itself around her, and she had never had occasion to learn that it would not always do so. The letter came on a Tuesday in October. It was addressed to Sir Aldrich, but the seal, dark wax pressed with an unfamiliar crest, was not from a solicitor. Solicitors used plain envelopes. This was something else. Cordelia left it on the writing desk and went back to the kitchen, where Mrs. Horne was attempting to stretch a mutton shoulder into a dinner for 4. Cordelia helped her without being asked. She had long since stopped waiting to be asked. The conversation at dinner that evening was peculiar. Sir Aldrich sat with his napkin folded and unfolded in his lap, which he only did when he was working through something difficult. Arabella chattered about the new family that had reportedly taken Clare Hall for the season. Cordelia watched her father's hands and said nothing. After supper, he asked Cordelia to stay. He told her about the letter, about a man named Viscount Stanhope, about debts that had accumulated quietly for nearly a decade, the way snow accumulates on a roof before the weight becomes visible. He told her that the Viscount had purchased the mortgage on Ashvale through a chain of transactions that Sir Aldrich had not fully understood until it was too late, and that the Viscount was willing to renegotiate those terms under one condition. The condition was marriage. Not to Arabella. Arabella's name was not mentioned. The condition specified, with the cool precision of a legal document, that the eldest unmarried daughter of Sir Aldrich Penrose would enter into a formal engagement with Viscount Stanhope within the month. Cordelia sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the candle between them. She was the eldest unmarried daughter. Arabella had been briefly engaged 3 years ago to a naval officer who had died at sea before the banns were read. She still wore the fact of that almost marriage like a particular kind of sorrow, and no one pressed her on it. So it was Cordelia. She asked her father what would happen if she declined. He told her without dressing it in anything softer than the truth. They would lose the house before spring. There was no mortgage to renegotiate. There was only the one offer on the table. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days, which was all the time she permitted herself, because there was no version of those 2 days in which the answer changed. She wrote back to the Viscount's solicitor and accepted the terms. She had never met Viscount Stanhope. She knew only that he was 34, that he had an estate in the north of Westmoreland and called Dunmore, and that he had been widowed once, some years ago, under circumstances that no one seemed able to describe precisely. The first meeting was arranged for a Friday. The Viscount's carriage would arrive at noon. Cordelia spent Thursday evening pressing her best dress, which was grey wool and several years old and perfectly respectable. She did not stay up imagining what he would look like. She was past the age of imagining things she had no information to support. Instead, she reviewed the terms of the agreement. One more time, set the papers back in their folder, and went to bed. She slept well, which surprised her slightly. She had expected to lie awake. Instead, she found that there was something clarifying about the removal of uncertainty. The worst had already been decided. What remained was simply the living of it. On the Friday morning, 3 things happened. The first was that Arabella came downstairs in her best pale blue dress, the one with the silk trim, though she had not been told the occasion required it. She had simply assumed. She always assumed that occasions required her best. The second was that a delivery wagon arrived from Penrith carrying a small crate addressed to Cordelia. Inside was a set of household ledger books, new, with a note that read only, for the accounts at Ashfield, with the compliments of the House of Dunmore. There was no signature. Cordelia looked at the ledgers for a long moment, then set them on the writing desk. The third was that, when the carriage arrived at noon, it was not a carriage at all. It was a single horse, and the man who rode it wore a plain coat and no distinguishing markings, and he tied the horse at the post himself, without waiting for anyone to do it for him. Arabella, watching from the window, said, "That cannot be him." Cordelia, who had been standing near the door reviewing a list of things the house needed before winter, said, "Perhaps not. It was." He gave his name to Mrs. Horne as Mr. Hartley, which was his family name, the one before the title, and Mrs. Horne, who had not been briefed on what a viscount was supposed to look like, took him through to the morning room without ceremony and offered him tea, which he accepted. Cordelia came in 3 minutes later, because she had not been at the window watching for him. She had been in the still room, checking the state of the preserves. He stood when she entered. He was taller than she had imagined, which was to say she had not imagined him at all, and was now simply registering facts. He had a direct way of looking at people that was not rude, but was not deferential either. He looked at her the way someone looks at a room they are considering renting, not unkindly, but honestly, assessing the light. She looked back at him the same way. "Miss Penrose," he said. "Mr. Hartley," she said, because that was what Mrs. Horne had given her, and it seemed the name he preferred. She would learn later that he had given the false name deliberately to see how the household received a stranger of no apparent consequence. What he saw that first afternoon was this: a morning room that was clean and carefully maintained, with darned chair cushions and fresh flowers in a vase that had a small chip along the rim. A tea service that did not match entirely, but was arranged with precision. A young woman who did not flutter, did not angle herself toward the light, and did not attempt to fill the silence with pleasantries that would have strained them both. What Cordelia saw was a man who drank his tea without commenting on it, who looked at the shelves of books with genuine interest, and who asked her, halfway through the hour, whether the ledger books had arrived safely. She said they had. He said he hoped they were the right size. He had guessed, based on the household inventory his solicitor had prepared, that the standard commercial size would serve better than the estate-sized volumes. She said they were the right size. There was a pause. Through the wall, they could both faintly hear the sound of Arabella playing the piano, which she had begun some minutes earlier, with what could only be described as pointed timing. He did not ask about the music. She did not explain it. They continued talking about the estate accounts, which was, Cordelia realized afterward, a more honest conversation than she had expected to have with a man she had agreed to marry for financial reasons. He spoke about Dunmore without sentiment, but with clear knowledge. The drainage problem in the North Fields, the tenant cottages that needed re-roofing, the mill that had been idle for 2 seasons. He spoke about these things as problems to be solved, not ornaments to be displayed. She found herself listening carefully. He left after 2 hours. He said he would return the following Friday. He thanked Mrs. Horn by name on his way out, which was the sort of thing Cordelia noticed. That evening, Arabella asked what he was like. Cordelia said he was straightforward. Arabella said that wasn't much of a description. Cordelia said it was what she had. He came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, each time he arrived on horseback, in plain clothes, and each time he asked about something concrete. The east wing roof, the winter fuel supply, the state of the Ashville tenant leases. He was, Cordelia came to understand, not inspecting her. He was inspecting the situation. There was a difference, and she appreciated it more than she could easily have explained. What she did not know, could not have known in those first weeks, was what he was hearing. The house at Ashville was not a large house, and its walls were not thick. He arrived early, one morning unannounced, because his business in Penrith had concluded ahead of schedule, and the road to Ashville lay conveniently on his return route. Mrs. Horn let him into the hall and went to find someone, and he stood in the entrance passage for several minutes, waiting. From the morning room came voices. He was not trying to listen. He simply was not moving, and the door was not fully closed, and the house was quiet. He heard Arabella say, "She's going to marry a Viscount and spend her life going over numbers in a ledger room. It suits her, I suppose. She's always been better with lists than with people." He heard a third voice, an older woman, a visitor he did not recognize, say something sympathetic and indistinct. He heard Arabella say, "I don't blame James. Any sensible man would do the same. She's perfectly capable and perfectly dull. He'll have a housekeeper in a better dress." That's all. There was a pause. Then he heard a quieter voice, one he had not heard in conversation before, say, "The roof in the east wing needs attending before the first frost. I've written to the contractor in Carlisle." "Excuse me." The door opened. Cordelia walked out into the passage and found him standing there. She looked at him. He looked at her. It was not possible to know from her expression what she had understood him to have heard. Her face was as steady as it always was, composed in the way that belongs not to coldness, but to discipline, the kind that comes from having learned, over a long time, not to show the things that would not be received with care. She said, "Lord Stanhope, I wasn't aware you were expected this morning," he said. "I was passing. I should have sent word," she said. "I'll ask Mrs. Horn to bring tea." She moved toward the kitchen. She did not look back. He watched her go, her posture straight, her step unhurried, nothing in her bearing that asked for acknowledgement or for sympathy. And he stood in the entrance passage of a cold and carefully maintained house and felt something shift in him that had been still for a very long time. He had come to Ashville looking for a solution to an inheritance clause that required him to marry before his 35th year, or surrender the deed of Dunmore to a distant cousin. He had chosen Cordelia Penrose because his solicitor's inquiry had returned a family in need and a young woman of respectable character, and the terms had seemed practical. He had not expected anything beyond practicality. He had not expected someone who would look at him the way she did, as though she were assessing the light. Tea was brought. They sat in the morning room, which was empty now. Arabella had apparently gone upstairs. He asked Cordelia about the contractor in Carlisle. She told him. He asked whether she had compared the estimate against the mill account from the previous spring. She had. She produced the figures from a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and he looked at them, and they talked about the numbers for 40 minutes. And somewhere in those 40 minutes, the formal address quietly, almost without either of them marking it, became a question. He said, "What would you do with the Dunmore North Fields, Cordelia, if the drainage issue were resolved?" She looked up from the notebook. It was the first time he had used her given name. She considered it for a moment, as though testing whether it felt like carelessness or intention. Then she answered the question about the fields. She had opinions, clear ones, grounded in knowledge she had accumulated not from a governess, but from watching what happened to land when decisions were delayed too long. She had watched Ashvale decline by inches. She knew what neglect looked like from the inside. He listened without interrupting. At the end, he said, "That is almost exactly what my estate manager proposed last spring and what my solicitor argued against." She said, "What did you do?" He said, "I listened to my solicitor," she said. "And the North Fields?" he said, still draining badly. She did not say, "I told you so," because she had told him nothing, but something moved in her expression, not triumph, not mockery. Just a dry acknowledgement of a thing both of them understood, and he found that he wanted very much to see that expression again. The engagement was announced formally in November. There was a dinner at Ashvale, small and careful, at which Arabella wore the pale blue dress and played the piano beautifully, and was charming to everyone, and managed, without saying anything directly unkind, to position herself at the center of every conversation. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Cordelia sat beside Lord Stanhope. Beside James, she was beginning, privately, to call him, and passed him things quietly, and answered questions honestly, and said nothing for the sake of being heard. At one point, a neighbor's wife asked her how she was feeling about the match, in that particular tone that people use when they expect a performance of some kind. Cordelia said, "I am grateful for the arrangement and prepared for the work of it." The neighbor's wife looked slightly startled. James, beside her, said nothing, but she felt, in the stillness of him, that the answer had not displeased him. The wedding was set for February. The weeks between were full of practical matters, the transfer of accounts, the arrangement of the Ashvale roof repairs, which James undertook quietly, and without any suggestion that it was a favor rather than a correction of an existing problem. He sent workmen from Dunmore. He did not announce it. The work simply appeared one morning and began. No. Cordelia wrote him a letter. She wrote that she understood what he had done and that she was grateful, but that she wished, if it was possible, to be consulted about decisions that affected the house. Not because she doubted his judgment, because she had been managing the house for 4 years, and she found it difficult to go from that to nothing. He wrote back within 2 days. He said he had not considered that aspect of the arrangement and that he was sorry for it. He said she should have been consulted. He said that going forward, decisions about Ashvale would include her, and that, as for Dunmore, he had thought perhaps she might find it useful to have access to the full set of accounts from the beginning rather than inheriting a summary version. She read the letter twice. She had not expected to be apologized to. She had not, in her careful inventory of what she was, and was not permitting herself to expect from this arrangement, included that. She wrote back and said that access to the Dunmore accounts would be useful. Yes. She did not say anything else. But she kept the letter. February came with hard frost and a clear sky, and the church at Thornfield was cold enough that their breath was visible and the ceremony was short and quiet, which suited them both. Arabella cried, beautifully. Their father looked relieved in the profound way of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. Cordelia stood at the altar in a dress that was new, not lavish, but new, a pale cream wool that Mrs. Horne had insisted on with such unexpected feeling that Cordelia had agreed, be sure she fully registered agreeing. And she said the words clearly and without trembling, because she had made her decision, and she was the kind of person who, having decided, did not tremble. James said the words looking at her, not at the vicar. She noticed this. The house at Dunmore was large and cold and badly organized, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the way it opened up when fires were lit in the right rooms, or the way the morning light came through the east-facing windows in the library and turned the air amber. She had not expected to feel, within the first week, that there were things here worth caring about. The household was not difficult. It was simply rudderless. The housekeeper, Mrs. Greville, was experienced, but had been without clear direction for several years. Since the previous Lady Stanhope, whose name no one volunteered and which Cordelia did not press, and she had managed by maintaining the surface of things without addressing what lay underneath. Cordelia went through the household accounts in the first week. She made a list. She met with Mrs. Greville and asked her questions rather than giving directives, and Mrs. Greville, who had been braced for something else entirely, visibly relaxed within the first hour, and thereafter treated Cordelia with a directness that was its own form of respect. James watched this. He watched a great many things in those first weeks from a slight distance. He was not cold, he was careful. There was a difference, Cordelia was learning, between a man who kept a distance because he did not feel anything, and a man who kept a distance because he had learned, at some point, that what he felt could cause damage. She did not ask him about the First Lady Stanhope. She waited, she worked, she organized the linen closets and reviewed the tenant accounts, and overturned a drainage contract that had been mishandled for 3 seasons, exactly as she had suggested she would. She spent evenings in the library, which had a fire that drew well and a collection of estate records going back 80 years that she found, to her own mild surprise, genuinely interesting. One evening in March, James came into the library and found her cross-referencing the 1798 flood records against the current Northfield survey. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work. Then he came and sat in the chair across from her and asked what she had found. She showed him. They talked until the candle burned low, he said, at some point that she did not mark precisely. "I was told you were quiet," she said. "I am quiet," he said. "That is not the same as having nothing to say." She looked at him over the papers. He was looking at her with that direct, assessing quality she had noticed from the first afternoon. But it had changed somehow. It was less like someone looking at a room they were considering, and more like someone who had moved into the room and was beginning to understand which corner caught the best light. She said, "No, it isn't the same." Spring came to Dunmore slowly, the way it does in the north of England, in fits and retreats. The drainage work in the North Fields began in April. Cordelia rode out to inspect it on a Tuesday morning, which Mrs. Greville mentioned to James in passing, not as a complaint, but simply as information, and James rode out after her and found her standing at the edge of the far drainage ditch, talking to the work foreman with the same focused directness she brought to everything. He watched her for a moment before she saw him. She was not beautiful in the way Arabella was beautiful. She did not make rooms go quiet. She made rooms work. There was a quality to her attention. The way she listened when the foreman described the problem. The way she asked the single precise question that reframed the entire solution. That James Hartley, Viscount Stanhope, who had spent a decade managing a significant estate and sitting in rooms with significant people, recognized as something rarer than beauty. He recognized it as the quality that made the North Fields drainable and the ledger books balance and the house at Dunmore feel, for the first time in several years, like somewhere a person might actually want to live. She saw him then. She nodded once, without surprise. She turned back to the foreman and finished the conversation. When she walked over to him, she said, The eastern channel needs extending another 40 feet. It will cost an additional £12, he said. Fortinize it, she said. I already did. He looked at her. Something in him released, quietly, without drama, the way good drainage works. Not a flood, simply a slow and steady resolution of what had been accumulating too long, he said. Cordelia, she said. James. It was the first time she had used his name aloud. They both knew it, he thought, later, that she had timed it deliberately. Not for effect, but because she had waited until she was certain. She was the kind of person who waited until she was certain, he said. I want to tell you about Dunmore, the parts that aren't in the accounts, she said. All right. They rode back together. He talked. She listened in the way. She listened entirely, without filling the silences, and what he told her was not simple and was not flattering to himself in all parts, and she did not offer him false reassurance or easy sympathy, which he had not wanted and which she had understood. He had not wanted without being told. What she offered him was steadiness, her own, the kind that does not require conditions. He understood, somewhere in the space of that ride home, that she had been offering him that since the first afternoon in the morning room. He had simply not known, then, what it was worth. He had required the winter and the work and the lit fires and the balance sheets and the North Field drainage and a Tuesday morning in April to arrive at the understanding that certain things reveal themselves slowly and only to those paying the right kind of attention. The tenants at Dunmore that summer began to call her Lady Stanhope without prompting. The older ones, who had been there long enough to remember the estate before the years of drift, said she had a way of knowing what needed doing before being asked, which was the highest practical compliment in their vocabulary. One old man who farmed the southern edge of the estate told his wife she reminded him of the land itself. Not showy, not given to weather, but sound to the foundation and good for the long work. James heard this third hand from the estate manager. He told Cordelia about it. That evening, at dinner, in the simple way of passing on something that seemed worth the passing. She looked at her plate for a moment. Then she looked up at him and said, "That's very kind." It was said with the particular composure of someone who does not often receive acknowledgement and is not entirely sure what to do with it, but who is learning, who is, slowly and without ceremony, allowing herself to be known. He watched her face and thought about all the rooms in a house that go unlit for too long, not because no one cares for them, but because no one has thought to open the shutters. He thought about east-facing windows and amber morning light and the quiet industry of a woman who had spent her life making things work without being thanked for it, and who had arrived at Dunmore with a notebook in her apron pocket, and the unhurried certainty of someone who knows, without needing to be told, which corner catches the best light, he said. It isn't kindness, Cordelia. It is simply what they see. She looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the north fields were draining properly for the first time in years. The east wing roof had been sound since October. The ledger books were balanced and annotated in a careful hand. The house that had been drifting, quiet and cold and uncertain of its purpose, had become in the course of a single year, and without any grand announcement, a home. It was not the kind of thing you could point to and say, "Here, this is where it changed." It had happened in pieces, the way all true things do. In a letter about accounts, in a conversation about flood records, in a Tuesday morning in a muddy field, in the slow and deliberate movement from Lord Stanhope to James, from Miss Penrose to Cordelia, from the careful language of a contract to the quieter, more consequential language of a life that is actually being lived. She had come to Dunmore to be useful. She had not come expecting to be seen. She had not known those would turn out to be the same thing.